If you're somebody who really likes succulents and you're already growing them in your area, then it might be safe to assume that you are already a creative person who really likes to see beautiful things. And so in this video, we're going to be talking about garden design ideas that might seem to make your succulents more beautiful but are actually impractical and may not be actually very good for growing succulents. So I will be reacting to 5 different garden ideas and I will be showing their images right at the side of the screen here, so you can have an idea on what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be ranking them. I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on these type of garden decors. Now for the first one, we're going to be talking about plant shelves. Now I don't hate all types of succulent plant shelves because I know a lot of people overseas are growing succulents in plant shelves, and they just have a different method of growing succulents in plant shelves than what you might be accustomed to. Now some of you might think that plant shelves make succulents look even better because you have this stacking ability and you can see a lot more succulents from a distance because they're on a shelf. Probably they're in a ladder type of shelf. But what I found out and what I know about succulents really is that they don't like to be shaded on top of them. So if you were gonna put another shelf on top of this, you're going to be shading a lot of these succulents. You will be depriving them of the sunlight that they need, so your succulents may etiolate, and in the worst of cases, your succulents can also get rot. Now, as I said before, I'm not hating all type of succulent shelves because there are some types that have these really long distances, and that may contribute with the sunlight exposure that the succulents will be getting from down below, and they can still have the right amount of sunlight in your area, and they can also have, the top layer could also have the right amount of sunlight that it would need. So those type of shelves can probably be useful when it comes to growing succulents. And some other people who are using shelves actually have these grow lights under each layer so that their succulents can still get sunlight even if they don't get direct sunlight anymore. So some of the shelves that you might be seeing on YouTube will actually have grow lights underneath them, and that is actually what I would say wise way of using succulent shelves if you can put grow lights underneath them. But if you're gonna be using a plant shelf that is in a tight space that doesn't get a lot of sunlight around it, and if you're noticing that the succulents below are etiolating, so a succulent shelf may not be good for you or your area or for the type of care that you're giving your plants. The second garden decor idea that I don't like are hanging baskets. Now you might already see as well here in my space, I can actually have a lot of space that I can put hanging baskets on, and I can actually hang my succulents up there, but I chose not to because it has the same effect as having a plant shelf. It will shade out the succulents that are below, and it will cause them to etiolate, and they will get these uneven types of rosettes because we all know succulents, they are rose shaped, and if some parts of them don't get the amount of sunlight that they need, those parts could etiolate while the other parts of the plant may not etiolate. So it will result in a not very good looking succulent. So for example, we have these Echeveria bend bodies. So if this part of the plant is always getting shaded, the center part of the growth will start to etiolate that way. These leaves will tend to get longer, and these leaves will tend to get smaller because they're getting less sun here, so they're trying to widen out their leaves so that they can receive more light, and then they will also try to etiolate that way. So that will cause your succulent to not grow in a typical healthy way, in a typical rosette type of way. So for example, I have this. So now this was not etiolated, but this is quite a particularly good example of how a succulent might etiolate if it doesn't get enough sunlight. So for example, if you're not putting sunlight here, if the succulent is not getting sunlight here, it will tend to etiolate this way. Now this is not etiolated, so this just stayed leaning like that because the potting mix it's in is very loose, so it doesn't support the plant very well because the top part is very heavy. So what the plant did is it just leaned itself over, and I didn't want to touch it anymore, so I just let it grow like this. But if your succulent is not top heavy at all, and if it's etiolating in one direction, then you might want to adjust your sunlight. You might want to adjust the sunlight that you're giving them, and you might also want to clear the top layer of your succulents of any obstructions that might contribute to them etiolating, that might decrease the amount of sunlight that they're getting. The third garden decor idea that I don't like are glass containers. Now, you might already have seen this before if you've been looking up succulents online. In a lot of places, in a lot of websites, you might see these succulents that are grown in a fishbowl type of situation where there is soil inside of that fishbowl and the succulents are arranged neatly inside, and then there's an added like rocks at the top of the plants, so as a top dressing. And sometimes they could also contain cacti and haworthias in those glass containers. But if you're going to think about it, really glass containers are very hot, especially if you're living in the tropics. Glass tends to absorb a lot of heat, and it will make the inside of that arrangement really hot, so it might contribute to the plant getting heat stressed. It might not drink any water, and if you water that, and if the pot that you're planting it in, if the glass container doesn't have drainage holes, then the plant could also get overwatered. Now that is a problem if you're already living in a tropical area in a very humid condition, and you're gonna put your succulents inside a glass container. That might contribute to the humidity that the plant is getting, so the plant could get rot and it might not do well. And also, if you're growing succulents in these little tiny containers, you might not be able to see them grow to their full potential. Now, some other people like to grow succulents because they are small, because they are compact, you can fit them anywhere. But some others will also want to have big succulents. So like me, I like my succulents big. I don't like them to stay compact. I want them to grow more. I want them to produce pops. I want their rosettes to become wider. So I actually avoid planting them in these tiny small containers. Now, the fourth succulent garden decor idea that I also don't like are succulent bird cages. Now, you might already have seen this with some YouTubers growing in Australia, and some of their bird cages can tend to look very good, especially if the plant is looking very lush and you don't see a lot of stems. So that might be very good. But personally, I don't like to see succulents growing in bird cages, because if they're a rosette type of succulent and if they're confined into that small space, then their leaves may touch the side of the bird cage, and it might not look very good. So it might be better if the succulent is planted from outside and then the stem is planted inside, and then that might be better for growing succulents. But you will have to establish them there, because if you have this small rosette outside of a bird cage, then it might not look very good. So bird cages, I think, are very complicated, and I think it makes the gardening, it makes the care of the plant that's planted in there, it makes it much harder to care, to tend for, because the plant could also dry out their leaves and it might be harder to reach inside the bird cage. And actually, if you're growing succulents that are in a much more complicated situation, you might find yourself caring for them less. So what I found out, if my succulents were spread apart, then I will be caring for them less. So that, because caring for them requires much more effort, so then as a result of that, I will not be caring for them as much compared if it was easier for me to care for them. So for example, if they're in already a bird cage, it might be very difficult for me to clean up after them, and it might be difficult for me to water them. It might be an effort for me to move the bird cage back and forth for cleanup and for watering. So which is why I really don't like succulent bird cages. Now, some other people might get away with that. Some other people actually like to have bird cages on their succulents, but me personally, I don't like it. I don't like the look of it. I will probably go with something else. If I have the space for it, I could probably go with a succulent fountain or succulents planted in these bird baths. So if you have that, a dried out bird bath, you can plant your succulents there. That might look much better than a succulent bird cage. Now, the last garden decor idea that I really don't like are succulents planted in shells. Now, you might already have seen this. There are a lot of different varieties of shells. There are shells that are taken from clams, and there are shells that have this spiral shape. So there are a lot of different types of shells, and there are also pots that are made out of shells that are stacked on each other. So that was kind of like a life hack. Somebody probably did it, and then they planted succulents in it. So that might seem like a good idea, but for me personally, it doesn't look very good, because you have these like clam shaped shells, and if you plant your succulents in it, the shape of the clam actually distracts the viewer from the shape of the succulent. So succulents may seem like they belong there because succulents look like they're underwater plants, but actually they don't do very well in that. They don't look very well on that. And if you're gonna be putting this hanging type of succulents at the sides of the clam, then it doesn't look very nice. It doesn't have that neat appearance that succulents should have. So I would actually go for a more a succulent bowl type of arrangement. That would be better looking for me. And also, if you have these little spiral shells, probably like a nautilus shell or some other type of shell that is spiral in shape. So I don't know the exact name of the spiral shells that we have, but those ones, they might look good. So they might be good for temporary decorations when it comes to growing succulents, but they're not good for long-term growing of succulents because they have these small spaces inside of them that doesn't really allow a lot of roots for succulents to grow. So it doesn't have a lot of space for roots to grow. So I would really not want to plant my succulents in those type of areas, in those type of containers. Now again, as I said before, your opinion might differ to mine, so you might actually like to have those type of arrangements, especially if you're growing in a pretty mild climate, in a temperate location. Then you might be able to get away with planting them in shell containers because succulents there in other climates actually grow anywhere. You can just plop them anywhere and they will just grow. But here in the tropics, we don't actually have the very best conditions for growing succulents. So succulents in our area might be much more difficult to grow. They might need a lot more attention, which they will not get if you're planting them in these tight, small containers. So I would only do that probably if I was living in a much more colder climate where succulents can grow actively and they can drink up the water in their containers because they're growing actively, and they will not get rot if they're planted in those. But here in the Philippines, I've tried doing these small succulent arrangements before and my succulents really didn't do well. So I'm actually avoiding that. Succulents in shells, succulents in glass containers. Actually, I'm also avoiding succulents in ceramics. So you might see none of my succulents, or just a handful of my succulents, are actually grown in ceramics. So not all of them, they're all in plastic containers which have a lot of drainage holes. So these, I think, are the best setup that I really like for my succulents. So if you're also living in the tropics, then I hope that you can get some ideas on the tips that I shared, on the reactions, on different garden decor ideas that I gave. Now, I'm not against using succulents for decors because I know succulents are actually being bought and being sold because they look beautiful and because they add interest to your home. But if you're gonna put them in these really not very good conditions, then it might not make them grow very well, and you might be making it much more harder for them to thrive if you're growing them in this type of situations. So that's just the tips that I will be sharing with you today in this video. I'm actually always trying to shorten the length of my videos. So if you really like the tips that I gave you, please make sure to hit the thumbs up. If you have any other concerns or if you have any comments on the tips that I shared, please make sure to comment it down below so we can hear your thoughts. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, please make sure to hit the subscribe. Now I think that's about it for our video, guys, and I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.